All right, everyone. Moment of truth. As we go on, here's our dolphin. We've got all the parts modeled. As far as top-down modeled, we all have all the pieces there. Now we just have to go through and start to take a look at how do we get this thing moving. So right now, if you try to drag anything, it comes apart. So I'm going to go ahead and revert that position to bring that back. We're going to use some as-built joints to do that. Beforehand, though, let's go ahead and ground our stand. That's going to be our grounded component. And let's go ahead and do an as-built joint. So here's what we got to start taking a look at is what are the things we want to kind of be moving together. So I'm going to start from the bottom. I'm going to change this over to a rigid. I want this axle washer and this crank to be rigidly jointed together. And I'm going to go ahead and say okay. Now I'm going to do an as-built joint, and I want the crank and the stand to have a revolute joint. Now it's going to ask for a point at which it wants us to pivot. So I'm going to hide the crank, and I want to choose the pivot point to be right here, and I'm going to choose the outside edge of this hole. Now you're going to see that turning once I turn the crank on, and once we see the motion, we're going to see how that crank is going to be spinning around, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay. I would like then to have same kind of situation. So whoops. So the other thing here that I'd like to have going on is that we're going to do the same thing with the washer on the top and with the pivot. But we want it to be a rigid between those two. As built joint one more time. I want a revolute joint between the pivot and between the stand. And again, I need to select the snap point. So I'm going to hide the pivot just that way I can see. I probably need to hide the follower so that way I can see this hole here. I'm going to choose the outside edge. I'm going to toggle the pivot back on and the follower. If I preview the motion, it's going to spin all the way around, but with some of the constraints, it's not going to be able to do that. So we're still working through this. So I'm going to select OK. From here, I need to have a rigid joint between my dolphin and between my follower. So that way those don't move. So here's the motion. I'm going to do an as-built joint. I need to choose the follower, and I need to choose the pivot. And I'm going to change this to a slider motion. Now the slider does need a point at which it's going to slide. So I'm going to go ahead. Again, I'm going to hide this follower, and I'm going to hide the dolphin. I want it to slide. I'm going to put my cursor on the top face, hold my control key, click right in the middle. When I animate or preview the motion, that's exactly what I want to happen, is that I want that follower to be able to go up and down and be able to see that slide right through that hole. I'm going to select OK. Last step here. We've got most of these set up and ready to go. The last thing is what I want is when this crank turns that this follower is going to turn with it. And with that, I'm going to go to the assemble panel, and I want to go to tangent relationship. So component 1 is going to be my crank. Component 2 is going to be my follower. So as I go through and I start to take a look at this, it may be where I'm clicking, so you saw the error that goes in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the crank, and I'm going to say I want this face on the inside of the follower, and then I'm going to hide the follower, turn the crank back on, and I want this face on the crank. And what you're going to see is that adjusted a little bit, and I didn't get an error message this time. So I'm going to select OK, turn the follower on, and now let's see what happens when I turn the crank. So now I get a tangent relationship. Those two faces are now staying tangent with one another. So when I clicked it the first time, you can't just necessarily grab the components. You actually have to grab the faces on the components, even though the menu says a component. So when I turn it, that's what kind of motion I'm getting as I go through, and I turn that around, and that's exactly what I'm wanting for my dolphin. So all the parts are moving just like the 3D printed part that I have there. If I want to toggle off joints, it looks a little bit better. And then if I want to expand the joints, here's my Revolute 2, which is this Revolute that's highlighting down here, and I can say animate joint relationships. And that's the one that's going to cause, it's the one that's tied with the crank. It's going to cause the motion to happen for me. So what I might want to do is I'm going to click cancel to stop the animation. I'm going to rename Revolute 2 to be, crank me. So that way I know this is the one that I need to animate. So there's our dolphin making the motion that needs to go. There's all the components moving as they should. So this goes through and completes the assembly. And again, if you want to go to home position, that'll set everything back into place. And there we go. We have our full assembly of our mechanical animal dolphin. Good to go and ready to be tested if you're 3D printing, or even if you're just going through and have 3D printed parts and want to mimic the motion here in Fusion 360. Hope you picked up a lot of things. Hope you've enjoyed this, and keep exploring what you can do with Fusion.